Have you ever carried a pain inside you, one that no bandage or medicine can touch? It's not a broken bone or a visible scar. Instead, it's an ache deep within your mind, a wound of the heart and soul. Psychological wounds, unlike physical injuries, often remain unseen, yet their impact can be just as profound, sometimes even more so. These wounds come in many forms: the sting of rejection, the heavy weight of grief, the persistent shadow of anxiety, or the silent echo of past trauma. They might whisper to us in sleepless nights, in moments of self-doubt, or in the cycles of negative thoughts that trap us in despair. For many, these wounds define much of our daily experience, shaping how we see ourselves, others, and the world around us. In our fast-paced, modern world, the challenge to heal these inner hurts grows ever more complex. We're inundated with information, distractions, and pressures that often deepen our sense of isolation. Sometimes, the harder we try to escape this suffering, the tighter it grips us. Yet there is a timeless question that echoes through the corridors of human history. Can these psychological wounds truly be healed? And if so, how? One ancient tradition offers a path that has guided millions for over 2,000 years. Buddhism, with its profound insights into the nature of suffering, doesn't promise a magic cure or an instant fix. Instead, it invites us to look deeply, to understand the root of our pain, and to cultivate a way of being that gently transforms suffering into healing. But what does this healing look like? How can teachings from centuries ago speak to the psychological struggles we face today? And can the mind, wounded and weary, find peace through the wisdom of the Buddha? As we embark on this exploration, we will unravel the ways Buddhism approaches suffering, not as an enemy to fight or a burden to hide, but as a reality to be understood and transformed. We'll journey through concepts that challenge our deepest assumptions about who we are and what it means to heal. Through this lens, healing becomes less about erasing pain and more about changing our relationship with it, learning to meet our wounds with kindness, insight, and courage. So, what if the wounds we carry aren't signs of weakness, but doorways to awakening? What if the journey to heal our inner pain? We all experience suffering. It's a universal truth that connects every human being across time and culture. But Buddhism doesn't just acknowledge suffering, it invites us to understand it deeply. What exactly is suffering? Why does it arise? And perhaps most importantly, how can we address its root causes? At the heart of Buddhist teaching lies a simple yet profound insight. Suffering is not random. It has causes, conditions, and a nature that can be examined with clarity. The Buddha called this understanding the Four Noble Truths, a framework that has helped countless seekers navigate their pain with wisdom and compassion. The first truth is plain and undeniable. Life involves suffering. It's not just physical pain or dramatic tragedy, but the subtle dissatisfaction, anxiety, and restlessness that we often carry beneath the surface. This suffering arises in many forms: birth and death, aging and illness, loss, disappointment, and the frustration of desires left unfulfilled. But the second truth brings an essential clarity. Suffering has causes. It doesn't simply happen to us like bad luck or fate. Instead, it is rooted in craving, attachment, and ignorance. These are not abstract concepts but lived experiences. The endless wanting for things to be different, the clinging to people or ideas, and the inability to see reality clearly. Take craving, for example. When we desire something intensely, a relationship, success, recognition, we create an inner tension. If those desires aren't met, we feel frustrated or unhappy. But even when they are fulfilled, the satisfaction often fades and the craving returns, like a thirst that never quenches. Attached to craving is the emotion of aversion, anger, hatred, or resentment toward what we dislike or fear. These forces pull us in opposite directions, tossing our minds into turmoil. Together with ignorance, a lack of understanding of the true nature of ourselves and the world, they form the roots of suffering. Buddhism introduces powerful ideas to shift this perspective. Concepts like impermanence or anicca remind us that everything is constantly changing. Nothing we hold onto is permanent, not even our feelings, our problems, or our identities. The notion of anatta, or non-self, challenges the deeply ingrained belief that we have a fixed, unchanging essence. By seeing that our sense of self is fluid and interconnected with all things, we begin to loosen the grip of ego-based suffering. And finally, the principle of dependent origination reveals that nothing arises in isolation. Our pain is part of a web of causes and conditions, and understanding this can empower us to break harmful patterns. Recognizing suffering's causes is not about blame or guilt, it's about insight. It's a map for healing, pointing us toward the practices and mindset changes that can free us from the cycle of pain. So, when we understand suffering as a natural process, born from craving, aversion, and ignorance, we open the door to transforming it. This transformation doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from facing it with clear eyes and an open heart. As we move forward, we will explore how Buddhism offers practical tools to heal, tools that help us observe our pain without being overwhelmed, that teach us kindness toward ourselves and others, and that invite us to let go of what no longer serves our well-being. Because true healing begins not by escaping suffering, but by learning to be present with it, fully and compassionately. Imagine for a moment, your mind is like a turbulent ocean, waves of anxiety, fear, and restless thoughts crashing endlessly. What if you could learn to become the calm observer of this ocean, watching the waves without being swept away? This is the essence of mindfulness, a practice at the very heart of Buddhist healing. Mindfulness isn't about escaping pain or stuffing down emotions. Instead, it teaches us to meet whatever arises inside us, with curiosity, acceptance, and gentle attention. The power of mindfulness lies in its simplicity. By paying close, non-judgmental attention to the present moment, whether it's the rhythm of our breath, the sensations in our body, or the thoughts passing through our mind, we begin to break the automatic patterns that keep us trapped in suffering. One of the most transformative forms of this practice is vipassana, or insight meditation. Here, the goal isn't to clear the mind or force happiness. Rather, it's to see reality as it is, moment by moment. When practiced consistently, vipassana allows us to recognize the impermanent nature of thoughts and feelings, so that we no longer cling to them or push them away. Modern science increasingly confirms what Buddhists have known for centuries. Mindfulness meditation changes the brain in profound ways. Studies show that it reduces activity in areas linked to stress and anxiety, boosts emotional regulation, and even increases gray matter in regions associated with learning and memory. But mindfulness isn't just about science or mental clarity. It's a radical act of kindness toward ourselves. When we become aware of our inner wounds, be it fear, sadness, or anger, mindfulness gives us the space to hold these feelings with compassion, rather than judgment or avoidance. This compassionate presence is crucial for healing. It softens the harsh self-criticism that often deepens psychological wounds and replaces it with a nurturing awareness. We begin to see that pain is not something to fight but a part of our shared human experience. Moreover, mindfulness opens the door to freedom from the constant chatter of the mind, the relentless what-ifs, and regrets that fuel anxiety and depression. By anchoring ourselves in the here and now, we reclaim a sense of peace that is always available beneath the storm. The beauty of these practices is that they are accessible to everyone. You don't need special beliefs or rituals, just a willingness to practice regularly, patiently, and with an open heart. Over time, this gentle training rewires the mind. The waves of turmoil become less overwhelming. The space between thoughts grows wider, and within that space, healing begins. As this inner calm deepens, it naturally flows outward, improving relationships, enhancing empathy, and fostering a sense of connectedness with all beings. In the next step of our journey, we will explore another powerful force in Buddhist healing, compassion and loving kindness, and how what if the balm to our deepest psychological wounds wasn't just understanding or mindfulness, but something even gentler, yet infinitely powerful, something that touches the heart directly. This is where compassion and loving kindness, known in Buddhism as metta, come into the picture. Metta is more than just a warm feeling. It's an active practice of opening the heart with sincere goodwill toward ourselves and others. Imagine for a moment, what would it feel like to treat yourself with the same kindness you would offer a dear friend in pain? To look upon your own suffering without judgment, but with warmth and acceptance. Psychological wounds often deepen because of one harsh truth. We tend to be our own worst critics. The voices inside our heads can be unrelenting, blaming, shaming, doubting. This inner cruelty fuels anxiety, depression, and isolation. Metta teaches us to replace that harshness with tenderness. In Buddhist practice, metta meditation involves intentionally cultivating feelings of loving kindness, starting with oneself, then extending outward, first to loved ones, then to neutral people, even to those we find difficult. This expansion is not naive. It is a radical reorientation of the heart's energy. Why is this so healing? Because compassion heals the fragmentation within us. Psychological wounds often fracture our sense of wholeness, leaving us feeling separate and alone. Loving kindness gently reunites us with ourselves and others, reminding us that connection is a fundamental source of healing. Science again affirms the power of metta. Studies reveal that practicing loving kindness meditation reduces social anxiety, increases positive emotions, and even strengthens immune function. It reshapes the brain areas related to empathy and emotional regulation. But beyond neuroscience, metta invites a transformation at the very core of our being. It nurtures patience with our own flaws and courage to face pain without running. When we meet ourselves with kindness, we create fertile ground for real healing, healing that can't be rushed or forced but unfolds naturally. In daily life, this practice becomes a lifeline. When overwhelmed by difficult emotions or old wounds, returning to loving kindness can steady the mind and soften the heart. It encourages forgiveness, not as forgetting or excusing, but as releasing the grip of resentment that keeps wounds fresh. Most profoundly, metta reminds us that healing is not a solitary journey. It connects us in a web of mutual care and understanding, dissolving the walls of isolation that psychological pain often builds. As we move deeper, we'll explore how Buddhist wisdom guides us in transforming negative emotions. Those heavy chains of anger, fear, and jealousy. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones, each stone representing a worry, a grudge, a fear, or a desire you just can't seem to release. With every step, the weight grows heavier, slowing you down, draining your energy. This image beautifully captures the essence of suffering tied to attachment. In Buddhism, one of the most profound keys to healing psychological wounds lies in the practice of letting go, or non-attachment. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent, but about learning to loosen the tight grip we have on things, whether they are people, outcomes, or even our own identity. Attachment is the root from which much of our pain grows. We cling to our ideas of how life should be, to the comfort of familiarity, to the illusion of permanence in a world that is constantly changing. When reality inevitably contradicts these attachments, suffering arises. But what does it really mean to let go? It means recognizing the impermanence of all things. This is not just a philosophical idea, but a lived experience, feeling the flow of change within yourself and your surroundings. When we truly see that nothing stays the same, not our emotions, not our relationships, not even our bodies, we begin to loosen our grip. Non-attachment is a radical freedom. It frees us from the endless cycle of craving and disappointment. Instead of chasing after what we desire or pushing away what we fear, we learn to meet life as it is, moment by moment, with openness and equanimity. This practice doesn't mean we don't care. On the contrary, it invites a deeper care, one that isn't dependent on possession or control, but arises from genuine presence and understanding. Letting go also means releasing the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives that keep wounds alive. Stories of blame, regret, or if only keep us stuck in the past or anxious about the future. By seeing these stories as mental fabrications, we gain the power to step outside them and find peace. This process of non-attachment acts like a deep cure for psychological wounds. Instead of simply masking pain or distracting ourselves, it addresses the very roots of suffering. It invites us to live fully in the present, unburdened by the chains of attachment. Practically, this can be cultivated through meditation, reflection, and conscious daily choices. When you notice yourself clinging, pause and ask, is this attachment helping or harming me? Can I let it go, even just for this moment? It's not easy and it doesn't happen overnight. But with patience, what if the path to healing psychological wounds isn't just within our minds, but deeply connected to how we live in the world? In Buddhism, ethical living is not merely a set of rules or moral codes. It is a foundation for mental health and spiritual well-being. At the core of Buddhist ethics are the 5 precepts, principles that guide us toward harmlessness, truthfulness, generosity, and respect for life. These are not commandments imposed from outside, but invitations to live with integrity and compassion. Why does ethics matter for healing? Because our actions shape our minds. When we act in ways that cause harm, whether to others or ourselves, we create internal conflict, guilt, and fear. This inner turmoil deepens psychological wounds, feeding a cycle of suffering. Conversely, when we cultivate ethical conduct, we build a stable ground of trust and safety within ourselves. Living ethically aligns our behavior with our values, reducing inner conflict and creating harmony in our relationships. This harmony is crucial for healing. Imagine trying to heal a wound while continually picking at it. In the same way, ethical living protects our mental and emotional well-being by preventing unnecessary harm and fostering positive connections. Moreover, ethical living nurtures self-respect. When we honor our commitments to kindness and honesty, we strengthen our self-esteem and reduce feelings of shame or self-loathing that often accompany psychological pain. Buddhist ethics also encourage us to be mindful of the ripple effects of our actions. Every choice we make, no matter how small, impacts not only ourselves but the wider community and environment. This awareness fosters a sense of responsibility and interconnectedness, which can be deeply healing. Importantly, ethical living is not about perfection. It's a path of continual learning and growth. Mistakes and setbacks are part of the journey, offering opportunities for reflection and compassion toward ourselves. Practically, ethical living supports psychological well-being by reducing stressors related to guilt, shame, and social conflict. It cultivates a peaceful mind, making us more resilient in facing life's challenges. As we weave together mindfulness, compassion, letting go, wisdom, and ethical living, a holistic picture of healing emerges, one that embraces body, mind, and spirit in a harmonious dance. Next, we will conclude by exploring how these elements come together to support lasting healing. Is never a simple, straight path. It is a journey, sometimes gentle, sometimes challenging, that invites us to meet ourselves with courage and compassion. Buddhism offers a timeless map for this journey, guiding us through the terrain of our psychological wounds toward freedom and peace. Throughout our exploration, we've seen how Buddhism doesn't promise to erase pain instantly or magically. Instead, it offers tools: mindfulness to bring clarity, compassion to soften the heart, letting go to release the burden, wisdom to illuminate the path, and ethical living to build a solid foundation. These elements work together like threads woven into a beautiful tapestry of healing. They invite us to transform suffering not by avoiding it, but by embracing it with open eyes and an open heart. Healing in this sense is not about perfection or escaping reality. It's about awakening to the truth of who we are beneath the pain, interconnected, ever-changing, and deeply worthy of love. This journey calls for patience, persistence, and kindness, especially toward ourselves. Each small step, each moment of awareness brings us closer to a deeper peace that is not dependent on external circumstances. And as we heal, we don't just transform ourselves, we ripple that healing into the world, inspiring compassion and connection in others. If this exploration resonated with you, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's walk this path together, learning, growing, and healing through the profound wisdom of Buddhism. Remember, healing is always within reach. One mind